Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this second plenary. Is it the second? Yeah. Okay, second plenary session of CAAS 2013. My name is Pius Adisami. I'm presiding with the Department of English here at Carleton and the Institute of African Studies. Our speaker today is a long-term co-founder, a good friend of mine, all the way back from the University of Ibadan. Well, he's currently a visiting scholar at Emory University in Atlanta. He was formerly chair of English Department and director of the Center for African Studies at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Harry Garuba is going to be giving us a talk entitled Playing with Modernity, the 419 Advanced Fraud and the Colonial Modern Imaginary.
So today I'm going to be talking for a couple of minutes on a very well-known Nigerian-initiated scam known as the 419. And I just want to say, first of all, that I got into this topic because, you know, in my readings around, like everyone else, I received these emails, first of all. But in my reading around it seemed to me that most of the work had been done largely by criminologists and others who adopt a very empirical approach and are a bit more interested in crime and prevention, internet fraud, and so on and so forth. And I thought that we required something more intellectually sound and conceptually sophisticated to understand what these scams represent as social and cultural texts. So what I'll be talking about today is basically the initial preliminary thoughts on my exploration of this phenomenon. And I've called it Playing with Modernity because I want to focus not so much on the 419 scams in particular, but the historical and discursive conjuncture from which they arose. And this is what I'm referring to here as the modern, colonial, modern imaginary. So I begin this paper with two quotes. The first is from Mahmoud Mamdani, a well-known political scientist who has written about these things for quite some time. And the Mamdani's quotation is from a series of lectures he gave at Harvard University last year that have appeared in a book called Define and Rule, Native as Political Identity. Mamdani says, and I quote, "The management of difference is the holy cow of the modern study of society, just as it is central to modern statecraft. The shift from a homogenizing impulse to a preoccupation with defining and managing difference is most evident in the transition from direct to indirect rule. I argue that it is under indirect rule colonialism that the definition and management of difference was developed as the essence of governance. The difference between the modern democratic state and its colonial version is this. The modern state ensures equal citizenship in political society while acknowledging difference in civil society. But its colonial counterpart institutionalized difference in both the polity and society." End of quote. The second epigraph is taken from Andrew Smith, who's written quite a lot about the 419 scams, and he has a book called The Culture of Corruption. And in this article entitled Nigerian Email Scams and the Charms of Capital, Andrew Smith says, and I quote, "This article then offers a speculative thesis in explanation of the extraordinary effectiveness of these 419 scams based on the analysis of 550 examples. Rather than considering these emails in terms of their criminality, I want to suggest, firstly, that we should recognize that they reveal something about post-colonial economies of knowledge, about the ambiguous forms of worldly awareness which contemporary mass media facilitate. And that secondly, following Adorno's lead, they reveal something about the struggle to, quote, and this quote is from the Comoros, to plumb the magicalities of modernity, which has been such a concern in the anthropological discussion of contemporary witchcraft in Africa. So those are the two epigraphs with which I start, which you will see why they are important to this paper. The Nigerian-initiated advanced fee fraud, otherwise known as 419, has become an object of attention on a global scale. From modest beginnings in the early 1980s, when the conmen and scanners depended primarily on mailed and fax letters, it has since plugged onto the new information and communication technologies of the cyber age, and in the process acquired greater reach, greater spread, greater visibility, greater speed, and greater intensity. From being a local phenomenon and a practice of some localized concern, the use of electronic mail and the internet has both democratized the social and class location of the pool of practitioners and has globalized their geographical locations in ways that would have been unimaginable to its originators 3 or so decades ago. With this democratization and globalization, even the basic structure of the letters have changed. And this basic structure, recognized several years ago, and recognized several years ago by several commentators, has fundamentally changed in ways that the range of subjects which are deemed fit for narration have expanded. The subjects to whom they are addressed have expanded. In the old days, actually, if you had a Nigerian name, you were slightly immune from this because, they recognized Nigerian names. But these days, there is no such recognition. In fact, in an article by somebody called Martin Overton in a spam, in the VB Smart Spam Bulletin, the author says, when I last visited this topic in 419 scams in 2003, I described what they are, how they work, and how they were developed over the years. From the original paper-based versions sent via the post or via fax to what we now have, email versions that most of us see day in and out. And he goes on to say, this article will focus on the changes that have been seen in the scam over the last few years. So he tells us that the scam has basically changed from the first from the first times they were sent out to the scams that we receive now. So originally framed around the availability of a secret stash of money ready to be transferred to the recipient's account upon the payment of some monies to clear bureaucratic and legal hurdles, the letters now trade in material as diverse as internationally known disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, terror attacks, terminally ill benefactors, girls about to be circumcised, winning lottery numbers, problems with your internet banking account, which you can rectify by logging onto a link provided, and the use of email accounts of friends known to the recipient who claim to be stranded in some distant airport because their passports and money have been stolen. As the technologies available for role-playing and assuming new identities have increased, so have the pool of players and the range of material they use and the narratives they deploy. So these days, you are likely to receive mails from an employee of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation or the Nigerian Central Bank, as you are to receive one from Arafat's widow or Gaddafi's confidant, not to mention your personal friend who is stranded at Heathrow Airport. You're also likely to encounter the legalese and high finance speak with a sketching of legal terms such as affidavits, certificate of registration, power of attorney, legal remittance notice, schedule of fund transfer release form, and so on, as you are likely to read the religious pieties of a dying woman or a bashful request from donations from a child soldier trying to remake his life. No longer restricted to petrodollars, high finance and the bureaucracy of the corrupt state and its officials, natural and man-made disasters in the news, as well as lottery numbers and malfunctioning internet bank accounts are all now further for the scammers. Actually, I received one a week or so ago from somebody who had been at the Boston Marathon. So, every international disaster that makes the news becomes the subject for this. Now, 419 has recently become the theme of 2 award-winning novels. I brought some of the novels there. 2 award-winning novels by first-time Nigerian novelist and an established Canadian writer. Adaobi Tricia Mwabwani's I Did Not Come to You by Chance mimics in its title the language of the emails themselves. And Will Ferguson's 419 takes its title from the popular name of the scam, derived from a section of the Nigerian legal code, which criminalizes advance fee fraud and is specifically directed at the scammers. Just to give you an idea, just to give you an idea of this is the novel I Did Not Come to You by Chance, which won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize in 2010. And this is Will Ferguson's 419, the novel which won the Canadian Scotiabank Giller Prize in 2012. And a student of mine who was in California some time ago found this, which is a humorous take actually on 419. It's called Strictly Confidential, A Cry for Help. And what it does, it plays around with, a lot of these emails. Can you just pass this around? So basically, humorist, artist, every section of society, if you like, has now become, material for the scammers. So novelists, musicians, satirists, humorists, and so on have also not been left out of the global industry. It has featured in a rap song in Nigeria. It has featured a subplot in certain Nollywood films. And in fact, it has become a generic noun that names certain kinds of deception and trickery. And it's used sometimes as a verb in Nigeria, as when someone says, this man wants to 419 me. Now, you see, I'm giving this idea of the phenomenal growth just to give a sense of the fact that this is not just a phenomenon which can be restricted to the scam letters alone, but a phenomenon which has permeated society in such a way that it has become what Smith calls the culture of text. This phenomenal growth since the 1990s has ensured that apart from attracting the attention of the media and law enforcement agencies, it has become the subject also of academic studies. First, by criminologists, computer scientists, security experts, economists, specialists in banking and finance, and a broad range of policy wonks who are oriented towards prevention and what the state can do. These studies usually examine, this body of studies usually examines it from the perspective of criminality and combating crime, securing international trade and financing the activities of these scammers by shoring up banking and internet security, and so on. The overall objective of this first group of studies is to detail the nature and extent of the crime and explore the avenues for regulatory and preventive action. And these kinds of material appear in journals such as United States Attorney Bulletin, where a certain Jim Buchanan wrote a piece investigating and prosecuting Nigerian fraud. Um, Australian journals such as Trends and Issues in Crime and Criminal Justice, where a couple of people, Russell Smith and others, wrote an article called Nigerian Advanced Fee Fraud. And this is a journal of the Australian Institute of Criminology. Now, in addition, just to give a few examples, in addition to studies of this first kind, there have also been studies by rhetoric and communication scholars, sociolinguists, and semioticians. And this group of scholars are interested in the techniques and genres of narrative and persuasion deployed by these scammers. In fact, in one of the pieces, the author says, you know, I used this in my composition class, and I was wondering, how could you use, with such bad grammar, how could you use this in a communication class? But then it goes on to detail why he uses it to exemplify techniques of persuasion. So studies of this second group focus on speech and narrative genres, the conventions that govern them, their structures, and the typologies of these kinds of genres. And they also focus on the kinds of competencies. You know, linguists always talk of competencies, you know that. And the incompetencies, if you like, that the scammers bring to their art as they deploy these various speech forms or narrative forms. And examples of these, I'll just give two. A certain Wendy L. Kirker and others have an article called Genre Narrative and the Nigerian Letter in Electronic Mail. And this appeared in the proceedings of the 40th International Conference on System Science. And one I particularly like by Jan Blumert and Tokwa Moni called Email Fraud, Language, Technology, and the Indexicals of Globalization. Now there is a third group, a third category of academic studies, likely undertaken by social scientists and Africanists, and they have weighed in by examining the local conditions which aided the flourishing of the 419 phenomenon in the 1980s. And in some cases, they try to draw connections between this local phenomenon and the conditions of global capitalism. These studies often conduct detailed explorations of the local context, economic, social, political, in which the 419ers operate and flourish, and the ways in which these relate to the failures on the one hand of the Nigerian state or the African state, and the political economy of oil-dependent third world countries more generally. And on the other, they look at the global scene and globalization and the magics, if you like, of high finance and transfers. And the most notable of these group of articles is one written by Andrew Apter. This article is entitled IBB equals 419, Nigerian Democracy and the Politics of Illusion. And the second one, of course, is the one by Andrew Smith, which I already mentioned as part of my epigraph. And there are a couple of others which also deal in this kind of, in fact, there's one by a Cameroonian called Cameroon Femen and Nigerian 419 Scammers, two examples of Africa's reinvention of global capitalism. So in fact, the studies have moved away from the local terrain of their emergence towards the angle of globalization and globalization studies. So ironically, it would appear that 419 has spawned a global industry of its own, spanning a diverse collection of disciplines that range from law to computer science, to social sciences, field of area studies, and so on and so forth. Now, in this context of the proliferation of studies, what is the rationale for this intervention? Briefly, this paper arises out of two concerns. Two concerns about the predominant directions these studies have lately taken. The first is that with the globalization of the 419 phenomenon, academic studies have followed suit, been increasingly inserted into the domain of globalization studies, and thus leaving behind a longer history of colonialism and modernity in Africa. So that terms such as global capitalism, global communications, mediated communication, global flows, media images, and so on and so forth, are increasingly becoming the key words through which 419 is understood and analyzed. While certainly valid and legitimate, this movement in the direction of globalization and the adoption of the key words of globalization studies unwittingly but effectively erases or obscures the significance of the local, even while the studies seem to make it their point of departure. The manner in which 419 fits into the global landscape of capital and communication becomes the focus of study rather than the longer and larger legacies of the conditions of its emergence within the colonial modern imaginary. My second concern is this, that thus far, 419 has yet to draw much serious scholarly attention of the broadly critical humanities type that explores the genealogy of its historical emergence. The highly valuable studies I mentioned earlier, studies by scholars such as Andrew Apter and Andrew Smith, for example, which go beyond the empirical social sciences and attempt to read 419 as cultural texts that speak to and signify specific historical moment, are limited by their overwhelming focus on the present. While a social and ethnographic understanding of the present is unarguably valuable, a failure to connect this to a deep history that reaches further back limits the overall value of studies of this nature. So what I attempt to do then is to shift the terrain of scholarly engagement in this critical humanities direction by looking genealogically at this phenomenon in relation to the manner in which African subjects were inserted into modernity through colonial conquest and indirect rule. Recognizing the value of works such as Apter's and Smith, this intervention reaches beyond the present conditions that have led to the flourishing of 419 to examine the conditions of its emergence within the specific context of colonialism and modernity, and reads 419 as broadly representative of a generalized form of everyday deception and dissimulation that has become somewhat normalized in Nigerian society. And it is this normalization of forms of everyday dissimulation and deception that I refer to as playing with modernity. Playing with modernity, therefore, refers to an orientation which regards the modern as a domain of inauthenticity, a domain of untruth, a domain therefore available to be used in whatever ways subjects wish to position themselves within it, with little or no regard for the truth of their statements or claims within the domain. Considerations, moral and ethical considerations that generally govern their behavior in more traditional cultural settings are set aside within this modern domain. And there are a million common examples of this. I'll use some of them if time permits later. Common examples of this kind of everyday dissimulation includes the use of inauthentic English names, inauthentic birth certificates, inauthentic age declarations, all of these things which give the subject an age, a birth date that suits the purpose for which the document is needed. So if we truly see 419 as a new dimension of this practice of playing with modernity, of regarding the domain of the modern as a domain to which colonial subjects only go into to play with it, to play the rules rather than play by the rules, then we need to investigate the broader historical context in which this emerged in order to seriously understand its functioning as social text of greater significance than its present globalized representation. So what are the questions that I try to foreground in this study? Specifically, I want to find what historical and discursive conjunction created the enabling ground for this practice of playing with modernity. Given that discourses of slavery, colonialism, and reparation that the 419ers use and circulate themselves, is this practice a form of subaltern resistance? Or is it simply an internalization of and reproduction of the mechanisms and technologies of post-colonial power, as Achille Mbembe argues? How did this conjunction of indirect role colonialism and African subjectivity create an imaginary that made this practice of playing with modernity normative in everyday life, at least in its less criminal aspects? How did the 1980s and 1990s create further conditions for it to flourish in the manner that it has? And has the spread of the culture of the internet cafe in poorer countries, if you like, has this, like the emergence of the bourgeois cafes and salons, which Habermas associated with the emergence of the public sphere, have these spawned a new global criminal counterpublic, like the criminal counterpublic from those previously excluded and differently constituted through colonial modernity and the civilized nation? If subaltern counterpublics are conceived as spaces of resistance and liberation, which 419ers are obviously not, do other practices of the informal economies, which are also instances of playing with modernity, which are also filled with instances of playing with modernity, and sometimes, in fact, sit on the fringes of legality, do these provide us with an avenue to think together an oxymoron such as illegal and public? These are the kinds of questions that I try to foreground here. Now, what I'll do in the rest of this paper is to give you a sense of the histories and typologies of 419, describe the colonial modern imaginary as various scholars have spoken about it, and give examples of this, and try to conclude by looking at how discourses of globalization have made this, have taken attention away from this local context. Now, several accounts trace the origins of the type of advanced fee fraud that 419 represents to 16th century Europe, specifically during England's war with Spain, when the so-called Spanish prisoner swindle first emerged. Harvey Glignan gives us a good summary of this swindle, and I quote, 419 is supposed to be distant origin of it, 16th century Europe. These accounts say, and I quote, in its original form, wealthy merchants will be contacted by a stranger claiming to be part of an attempt to smuggle the sequestered child of an imprisoned family member out of a Spanish prison. The target will then share of the reward for freeing the child of the imprisoned parent in return for helping to finance the rescue of one or the other. Spanish prisons historically were said to be very brutal places. I'm sure you can imagine the resonance with post-colonial regimes. And the quote continues, pity for the child joins avarice to keep the target interested. The first rescue attempt would fail, as would a second, even more elaborate effort. One sees where this is heading. A convincing story would draw the victim into traveling to meet the intermediaries and into increasingly bigger payments. While the story to entice people has changed, the basic principles of the scam have not. End of quote. True, the basic principles of the Spanish prisoner scheme as represented here is certainly similar to the 419 scam. An advance fee, pity and avarice, a particularly brutal political regime, a sorry tale of victimization and great wealth, a promise of monetary compensation and reward for compassion and assistance, an advance fee or a series of advance fees as the story keeps morphing, as obstacles mount, and so on. In fact, it appears that this type of swindle had arrived in the British colonies in 1914. Glickman also tells us that, and I quote, in April, that's 1914, a letter was reprinted in the Nigerian Customs and Trade Journal from a certain Arthur Haggard, the British ambassador to Spain, calling attention to the Spanish prisoners' swindle, established in Madrid and other Spanish towns, assisted by accomplices in England. End of quote. He adds to the letter that, quote again, it appears that perpetrators of this fraud are still attempting to victimize victimize residents of the British colonies, and it is considered advisable that the public in Nigeria should be warned to be on their guard. Now, this was 1914. So, while it's true that the Spanish prisoner scheme has become the standard account of the origin of this type of scam, and of course that this had already arrived in Nigeria by 1914, an interesting article in the Australian Institute Journal of Criminology, in fact, also traces an Australian pedigree for this kind of thing. And here the article says that, I'll just quote this very quickly, the ruse has been used since earliest times. In Sydney in the 1840s, for example, an acme-named and wealthy man named Mr. Monies provided funds to one Nick Bell, described as one of the most cool, impudent vagabonds in Sydney, to finance the smuggling of a mythical £20,000 worth of goods out of the colony in a phantom ship. And of course, he was caught and so speaking of advance fee frauds, it's likely that examples can be cited from every country of this type of fraud. And, as this does not particularly respect the bounded geography of nation state. And so, as I said earlier, the most cited of these accounts are provided by Andrew Apter. And in gross summary, Apter's article focuses on the oil economy and the boom it created and the culture of the deal, which became all pervasive, and the illusion of easy wealth that this created, permeated all aspects of society. And Apter argues that when the boom became a bust, those who had mastered the art of the deal sought easier avenues, other ways to make easy money. And that in IBB's period, with IBB, an economy of illusion then went in hand in glove with the politics of illusion, in which reality itself was seen as a performance art, and so on and so forth. So this article focuses on the very present of the oil industry. But he observes that in an article written in the Nigerian Observer in January 1976, they had already pointed out this idea of fakery, this perversiveness of fakery, fake credentials, fake names, and so on and so forth, and that this was becoming a problem. But Apter does not pursue this deeper history. Andrew Smith also focuses, does a highly informed, theoretically infected reading of the 419 scams, and he drawing upon Karl Marx, Adorno, and other theorists, he basically looks at the 419 scams as part of the global industry where the magicalities, what it refers to as the magicalities of modernity, of people trying to plumb the magicalities of modernity. But he also says, and this is very important, that the triumph of rationality has given birth to petty forms of irrationality, a willful form of self-deception for which the social conditions of late capitalism unrelentingly prepare subjects. And in saying this, he says his article is concerned in looking at in more detail the way in which the ideological instruments forged by modernity, by the offender, that is, common representations of Africa, have become the rhetorical basis of this CAAS. What I'm trying to argue here is that if they moved a little behind the present, they would have discovered that another history of dissimulation and deception which originated from colonialism, where subjects were seen as being inserted into a discursive field that was modern only if there was British subjects and colonial subjects were taken out of this domain. To be able to explore this history, we need to dislodge for a moment the centrality of the advanced fee component of this CAAS and look at it in ways that look at the forms of deception which pass in everyday life, which are not simply tolerated, but have become normative. I'll give a quick example of this separation of domains which allows for people to move between domains, because there's a whole lot of literature in it. You see, the Nigerian nationalist, Herbert Macaulay, he was a Lagosian who lived in Lagos and was always in trouble with the colonial authorities. But in Lagos, he was a citizen and could not simply be arrested by the British colonial power. And what they often did was anytime his work as a quantity surveyor took him to Abeokuta, Abeokuta was a protectorate under a traditional ruler. They would ask that traditional ruler to put him in jail. So at every point, Macaulay is in one space and he becomes a right-bearing citizen. Within another space, he becomes a rule-bound subject of tradition. And with this kind of, so the British may have used this for their own, and post-colonial regimes have used it. You see, another example, Ibrahim Babangida, who was a Nigerian military dictator, detained a famous lawyer, human rights lawyer, Gani Fawehinmi. When he was releasing him, instead of letting him go to his house, they drove him all the way from his jail to the home of his traditional ruler, the Oni of Ife. Basically, infantilizing a man to say, look, we hand you over to your traditional ruler. So this separation created a domain for colonialism and the post-colonial state. The modern became a place where you could also play these kinds of games. And for colonial subjects, the modern domain became the place where this inauthenticity was basically understood, socially understood, as normal. That is, that you could pass by breaking the rules within the public sphere the way that you could not do within the sphere of tradition. One of the earliest articles about this was Peter Ake's Colonialism and the Two Publics in Africa. And as I said, Mamdani has been one of the major theorists of this in recent times. It looks like my time is over, but let me conclude by saying that while it is important to look at 419 scams in terms of crime and criminality, it is also important to look at them within a larger, longer history of what I've been calling the colonial modern imaginary that allows, that in fact sometimes I could say sanctions everyday deception and dissimulation within a certain sphere of life, while it does not tolerate it within another. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Garba, for an engaging presentation. Now, our time is so far spent that I'm just going to skip my own response and open up the floor for questions, comments. Yes?
Thank you, Professor. I just wanted to ask about the imaginary. You focused largely on the imaginary of the authors of the they part of a modern colonial imaginary? Because there must be something imaginary for people who get them, because some people actually believe them.
Okay, I'm sorry I wasn't as clear as I should have been. I'm using the word imaginary to refer to the way it's used in contemporary social science, to refer to the way that people see themselves in the world, see themselves and orient themselves in the world. Not so much as imagination, as fancy, but as imagination meeting lived experience.
Yeah, but how do they see themselves in the world? The people who get the message.
So yeah, the people, of course, the people who get the message. I'm not using the colonial modern imaginary to refer to them. They are obviously just victims of this kind of deception, this kind of scam. The consequences have been. There's a lot of literature on, the consequences of this kind of thing, which have been. In fact, there's an estimate that it's cost was it 3 billion that was estimated in 2005? Ultrascan, a Dutch security company, said that in 2005, businesses and individuals had lost about $3 billion to these scams. In fact, this novel speaks of a man who committed suicide because the Canadian novel 419, a man who committed suicide because he had invested all of his money in these scams. So basically, they are not part of this imaginary, they are just victims of a major scam.
Where? Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't know how you presented the concept of modernity. So, would you contextualize it? Do you see modernity as being the same thing as European conquest? Or do you see modernity as being entirely absent in African development?
No.
How do you see modernity? Because it appears all over.
No, I'm speaking basically in a very restricted way about a colonial model and as a form of rule. Colonial governmentality, the difference between colonial governmentality and as what you have here, for example, is that everybody is supposed to inhabit the same domain, right? The same domain politically, socially, and so on and so forth. Everybody has equal. This a sense of horizontal citizenship. But that in the colonies, there was a differentiation between a sphere of rights-bearing modern citizens and a sphere devoted to rule-bound traditional subjects. And that this division, what Mamdani calls the bifurcated state, then normalized certain kinds of practices for the colonial subjects, which then created an imaginary of that nature. I once had a professor who gave a talk at the University of Ibadan, and the title of his talk was Work and Government Work. Basically, his argument was that government work is not regarded as work. That, work is different from government work. And these are all part of a certain colonial modern imaginary that sees this sphere as a sphere that you can play with, a domain for playing the rules and playing the rules. Yeah? Yes, sir.
Yes, just a question on the subject. How do we still know who is the subject? Especially, each time you are talking, trying to complexify the notion of the subject behind post. Actually, the subject has shifted so much that it's somehow lost into stratospheres of internet communication. So at points that we don't, it's difficult to still identify or fix, right, the meaning on this particular subject. So the question is, since you're looking at it from this graphical point, how do you still calling this Nigerian scam, for example, right? Since this subject has already shifted so much that to what extent do we know even if it is a Nigerian scam and not a South African scam and not a Canadian scam and not a Senegalese or a French? So how do we know, to what extent do we know about the identity of this subject, especially because it's happening into this space of non-fixity?
Well, I've been very careful by saying Nigerian initiated scam. I try to make that distinction by saying Nigerian initiated, right? Because I live in South Africa, and I see, internet cafes where, people who are not Nigerian are basically engaged in this thing. And I've also seen in South Africa people who carry Nigerian passports who are not Nigerians. So it's more complex than even the category Nigerian links, as it were, into all kinds.
You agree that you are yourself entangled into this discourse of modernity and fixing the meaning of this practice, which is actually very much more complex than what it seems to see, right? Surface.
Yes, my intention is not to fix the meaning at all. And as every Nigerian knows, the category Nigerian is very porous in that sense, and it homogenizes what is not homogeneous.